Welcome to the channel Democracy Undecided. In previous episodes, we've already taken several important steps. First, we tried to honestly figure out what democracy is not in textbooks, but in real life, where the pretty words and concrete consequences for ordinary people begin. Then, using Switzerland as an example, we saw how the structure of power, the work of the courts and the enforcement system affect the economy and citizens' safety. In the last episode, Democracy Without Misery, we approached the most basic question. How is it even possible that in rich democratic countries, people still live in poverty if food and resources are objectively sufficient for everyone? There, we talked about poverty in general, about unfair exchange, about a labor market that keeps people on a short leash, about how the rules of the game allow some to accumulate surpluses while leaving others for years on the edge of survival. But behind all these models and numbers, there is always a very simple animal reality. Eat today or don't eat today. It's one thing when a person temporarily goes through a few difficult months and manages to climb out. It's quite another when years go by in a state of constant undernourishment, debt, and fear that tomorrow they won't be able to pay for housing or feed their children. Long-term poverty is not just a low income, but life without any buffer. No savings, no influential contacts, no opportunity to ride out a crisis. Every emergency, a broken tooth, getting fired, a child's illness, turns into a catastrophe. When it's not just one person but entire groups, neighborhoods, generations living like this, special zones begin to appear on the map of democracy. Poor districts, ghettos, outskirts, where the rule "survive any way you can" gradually pushes out the official laws. In such a reality, legal options run out very quickly. Honest work is not always available, and even when it is paid so poorly that even with full-time employment, the money is not enough for basic needs. Banks have stopped giving loans, relatives are struggling themselves, social support is minimal or humiliating in form and nature. At this point, the system quietly pushes a person toward the fork, in the road that politicians prefer not to talk about out loud. Some people simply break. Months and years of living in constant stress, shame, and sense of one's own uselessness spill out into bursts of aggression, domestic violence, fights, impulsive offenses, sometimes with tragic outcomes. A person doesn't plan to become a criminal. At some point, they snap because they see neither a way out nor a future. Others make a colder but no less desperate decision. They go where at least something can be taken right now. Someone starts stealing food from a store because they are ashamed to borrow yet again and cannot stand looking at an empty fridge. Someone gets involved in small street schemes, reselling stolen goods, doing simple errands for those who control the local shadow economy. Someone agrees to work for those guys who offer cash here and now without asking too many questions. Step by step, poverty stops being just a social problem and turns into a direct pathway into crime for a part of the population. Over time, such neighborhoods stop being merely poor. They develop their own parallel system of rules. New figures appear, the ones who really solve problems, no longer members of parliament or police officers, but local bosses. Their own taxes emerge in the form of tributes collected from businesses, their own social programs in the form of cash handouts and help to their own forms of justice through force and threats. On paper, the residents of these districts live in the same democratic country as everyone else. In practice, they exist in a different world, where the official state appears only as rare police raids and bureaucratic refusals. In this episode, we will try to unpack exactly this link, how long-term poverty in democratic societies turns into crime, Why people who have had nothing to eat for years or who constantly lack money for the most basic things end up in the orbit of the criminal world. From petty food theft to involvement in organized networks that control entire areas. And the main question we will be asking ourselves, and you, is this. Is all this just a random system failure, or a logical result of the very rules on which modern democracies are built? This episode is the logical continuation of Democracy Without Misery. There, we showed that poverty in rich countries is not inevitable, but the outcome of political and economic decisions. Now we will take the next step and look at the flip side of that choice. What happens when tens and hundreds of thousands of people live for years in a situation where the structure of the state and the law essentially leave them not a single workable and dignified path forward? So that all these explanations don't sound like my personal guesses or my own logic about how poverty pushes people into the crime, let's refer to serious research. There are two important books by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, The Inner Level and The Spirit Level. The first explains what happens inside a person when they live under conditions of inequality and constant poverty. And the second shows how this then adds up at the societal level into an overall picture of crime and social problems at the level of entire countries. Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett's The Inner Level shows what happens inside an ordinary person who has been living for years under conditions of inequality and chronic poverty. The authors carefully unpack the psychological and biological mechanisms. Constant comparison with more successful people, a sense of low status, shame and humiliation, background anxiety and fear of ending up below everyone. In such an environment, people live in a state of permanent internal defense. Irritability and impulsiveness increase, self-control declines, and the future is perceived as foggy and unattainable. Under these conditions, breaking the law, lashing out violently, or moving into the shadow economy gradually stops looking unthinkable. If the system has been making it clear for years that you are superfluous, the boundaries of what is acceptable blur, and crime becomes one of the psychologically available options. It's important that these are not just pretty reflections. Wilkinson and Pickett rely on large-scale quantitative research. International epidemiological surveys on mental health in developed countries, samples of tens of thousands of people, cross-country comparisons and comparisons between US states, and reviews that pull data from millions of respondents. In these data sets, they and other researchers find a consistent pattern. The higher the inequality in the society, the higher the prevalence of the depression, anxiety disorders, self-destructive behavior, and problems with trust and self-esteem. And even when statisticians control variable for average income levels, the connection with inequality as such remains. In other words, the inner level gives us not a moral fable but a mechanism. How social hierarchy and all long-term poverty pass through the mind and body, making parts of the population much more vulnerable to the kinds of decisions we in this episode call a step into the crime. As continuation of this background, the spirit level works as an external, social layer of the same story. In this book, the same authors look not at individuals but at entire countries and states and ask a simple question. What happens to the society as a whole when inequality is high or low? They deliberately limit themselves to the rich world, about 24 developed markets democracies, and separately examine all 50 US states. For each society, they take official measures of income inequality and compare them with a whole set of statistics: homicide rates, imprisonment rates, prevalence of mental illness, teenage pregnancy, obesity, levels of trust, social mobility, and so on. This is not one lucky chart, but a recurring pattern across different data sets and slices. The result is stubbornly uncomfortable. Where inequality is lower, levels of violent crime are usually lower, fewer people are in prison, mental health outcomes are better, and trust and social cohesion are higher. Where the gap between top and bottom is large, problems are more numerous, and this affects not only the very poorest but also the middle class. These relationships hold even when we compare only rich democracies with each other, that is, at roughly the same overall level of wealth. In this sense, the spirit level gives us a map. It shows that high crime and social breakdown in democratic societies go hand in hand with high inequality. And the inner level explains what fills that map from within, through the psychology, stress, and behavior of real people who live at the bottom of the ladder and eventually reach a point where crime becomes for them a rational or at least understandable choice. And of course, Wilkinson and Pickett are not alone here. Research conducted in a large number of different countries by Feisenberg, Lederman, and Loyaza in their works Inequality and Violent Crime and What Causes Violent Crime shows the same picture. The higher the Gini coefficient, the higher the level of violent crime, especially homicide. On Gini versus homicide rate graphs, this looks like an almost straight upward sloping line. Thomas Piketty in Capital in the 21st Century and Capital and Ideology describes how capital and political influence have been concentrating for decades in the hands of a narrow top, leaving the bottom in a structurally hopeless situation, where crime becomes a reaction to the closed nature of legal opportunities. Elliott Currie, in Crime and Punishment in America, directly links a weak welfare state, poverty, and high crime levels, even in one of the richest democracies in the world. Statistics from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, the World Bank, the OECD, and the UN Development Programme on Inequality, Poverty, and Homicide confirm the same pattern. Where the income gap and the share of the working poor grow, levels of violent crime and the scale of the shadow economy almost always rise as well. If you put it all together, the picture becomes very clear. From the physiological mechanism described in the inner level, and other studies to the big graphs with the Gini coefficient and homicide rates, everything points in the same direction. Unequal distribution of wealth and weak social programs do not merely accompany poverty and crime. They systematically produce them, turning poor areas and vulnerable groups into a natural feeding ground for criminality. Of course, we can ask whether all this modern research might have found a correlation that reflects only today's picture and is actually misleading. Then we should look at the historical link between poverty and crime and see whether it tells a different story. But when we step back from the present and look at a longer historical perspective, the picture hardly changes. Studies based on archival data from the 18th, 19th centuries in different countries show the same link. Deterioration in the condition of the poor leads to rise in crime. Economists who studied 19th century Bavaria used crop failures and ripe prices increase as a natural experiment, and showed that when bad weather drove up bread prices and people became poorer, property crime, thefts, break-ins, pilfering grew noticeably faster. A similar result was obtained from records in the 18th century. Extreme weather fluctuations that harm access to food and income led to more crimes against property, even if violence did not necessarily increase. Later work shows that historically entrenched inequality also leaves a long shadow. Regions with high land concentration and a legacy of slavery or rigid class hierarchies are more likely to have higher rates of violent crime in the 20th, 21st centuries. In other words, in both past and present, The same logic repeats. When basic resources and opportunities are distributed extremely unevenly, poverty and crime go hand in hand. On this background, it becomes especially clear why we need not only numbers but also theoretical maps like those of Michel Foucault and Nils Christie. Foucault, in Discipline and Punish, show how in the modern era the contemporary prison takes shape and how the figure of the criminal emerges as a separate type of person. He carefully describes how power gradually shifts from public executions to more civilized forms of control. Prisons, schools, barracks, factories, and how these institutions begin to discipline primarily the lower and the poorer classes, turning part of the population into manageable class of offenders. Nils Christie in Crime Control as Industry shows the next step at the end of the 20th century. The system of punishment turns into an independent industry. The growth of prison population in US and Europe goes in parallel with growing inequality and shrinking access to normal, well-paid work. Prisons, security firms, and private contractors start making money from the fact that more and more people pass through the penal system. In the end, the historical picture looks like this. Economists and sociologists show how inequality and poverty have been pushing people toward crime over centuries, while Foucault and Christie explains how states responded not by eliminating the causes, but by building an even more powerful machine of surveillance and punishment, which itself lives off the surplus population. Historical critics of criminal policy point to another troubling fact. Power did not only respond to existing crime, it also actively created the categories of criminals. Sociologist William Chambliss, in his work including Power, Conflict and Crime, shows how vagrancy laws and similar norms were used to make the poor, the unemployed and itinerant people formally illegal so they could be jailed, used as cheap labor and kept under control. Michel Alexander in The New Jim Crow describes how in the US the war on drugs and mass incarceration became a new stage of racial and class segregation in a formally equal democracy. Entire communities receive the stigma of criminality and lose civil rights. Loïc Wacquant in Punishing the Poor shows how states shift from a welfare model to a prison state model, where social problems are not solved but simply locked up. Against this background, Foucault's idea that the prison and the figure of the criminal are a project of power, not just a response to evil, stops looking like a philosophical abstraction and becomes a description of a very concrete practice. Historically, power has not only fought crime, it has also decided whom to classify as criminals in order to more conveniently manage the dangerous, the poor, and the superfluous. A separate layer of research shows that it's not only about overall inequality, but also about a very simple, down-to-earth fact, whether a person has a job or not. Economists analyzing data across dozens of countries and all US states arrive at the same conclusion. When unemployment rises, property crime almost always rises after some time. In studies by Stephen Raphael, Michael Lean, Eric Gold, and others, we see that every additional percentage point of unemployment produces a noticeable increase in thefts and robberies. And research on Europe shows the same pattern, with unemployment amongst the less educated being especially dangerous, those who already have few chances of finding decent work. In other words, unemployment is not just a labor market statistics, it is a direct conveyor that turns some people from poor but law-abiding into those who sooner or later take a step towards crime. But poverty, inequality, and unemployment alone are not enough to explain crime levels. There is another key amplifier, that quality of institutions. Tom Tyler's research, Why People Obey the Law, shows something simple. People follow the law not because they fear punishment, but because they see the police and courts as legitimate and fair. If a person feels they are treated honestly, that they are heard and not humiliated, they are much less likely to go into crime or the gray zone. But when courts are perceived as tools for insiders, the police as a corrupt force, and the law as a form of top-down violence, following rules starts to look naive, while breaking them becomes a normal way to defend one's interests. In such an atmosphere, crime and the shadow economy begin to look not like exceptions, but like one of the usual ways to solve problems. Robert Sampson and his colleagues show in their work how collective efficacy operates, the ability of neighborhood residents to trust each other and jointly uphold order. Where people are ready to stand up for one another, talk to teens in the yard, and work things out together, crime is significantly lower, even when the district is poor. But this kind of internal cohesion almost never arises when the state is demonstratively weak or corrupt. In that vacuum, criminal structures quickly take over and start functioning as a parallel state. At the country level, this is reflected in numbers as well. Governance quality, rule of law, and corruption control indicators from the World Bank, OECD, and other institutions almost always move together with crime rates and the size of the shadow economy. Where indices show weak justice and high corruption, street crime and organized crime are usually higher. Reports by Transparency International in their Corruption Perception Index clearly show another link. Grassroots crime and elite corruption are not two separate stories, but two sides of the same institutional failure. At the bottom, people turn to the shadow and violence because they don't believe in fair courts and honest police. At the top, those who control resources and power casually break rules because they trust in their own impunity. Now that we've looked at where crimes come from, poverty, inequality, unemployment, and institutional failure, it's logical to examine how different types of crime actually work as mechanisms for redistributing resources. Because this is not one monolithic crime, but several different systems that each take and redistribute money, power, and safety in their own way. First, let's have a look at street crime, a chaotic and destructive redistribution. Let's start with the most visible layer on the street crimes: thefts, robberies, assaults, everyday violence. Research by Robert Sampson and colleagues shows that these offenses are almost never distributed evenly across a city map. They concentrate in neighborhoods where poverty, strong social stratification, and very weak community life overlap. People trust each other little, don't know their neighbors, and don't participate in any shared activities. In such places, nobody is really defending order from below, and the state often appears only as occasional police raids. It's precisely there that street crime becomes part of everyday life. At the national level, we see the same through the lens of inequality. Wilkinson and Pickett, in the spirit level, show that the greater the gap between rich and poor, the more aggression, status competition, humiliation, and the feeling of I'm worse than others there is, and the higher the level of violent crime. Maps and charts from UNODC in global homicide studies clearly show that regions with high inequality and weak social protection almost always have higher homicide and severe violence rates. But it's important to understand street crime is a very crude and destructive mechanism of redistribution. Yes, sometimes someone takes a wallet, a phone, a goods from a shop, someone robs another equally poor neighborhood, but in the long run the poor suffer more than they gain. They are robbed more often, their neighborhoods become even more stigmatized, and investment and normal business stay away. For the system as whole, street crime is not a solution, but form of self-destruction at the bottom of the social pyramid. Second, let's have a look at organized crime, a parallel state and shadow tax system. Here, redistribution is no longer chaotic but highly structured. Diego Gambetta in the Sicilian Mafia, The Business of Private Protection, shows that the Mafia is not just a gang, but a private provider of protection where the state fails to ensure security and contract enforcement. The Mafia takes over the functions of court and police for local businesses and residents, of course, for money. This is a classic shadow tax. Pay for protection and your shop won't burn, your cargo will arrive, your dispute will be settled in your favor. Research by Loïc, Wacquant, Michel, Alexander and others shows that organized crime often grows where the official state has long undermined the trust of poor neighborhoods. When the police are seen as a hostile force and the courts as an inaccessible or corrupt mechanism, criminal organizations step into the unoccupied social and political niche. They collect taxes from the territory, provide justice, and sometimes even distribute cash and food to their own, effectively substituting for a weak state. In redistribution terms, organized crime systematically pumps money out of small businesses and ordinary residents and concentrates it in criminal elites, occasionally returning part of it as social spending on insiders. This is not chaos, but a parallel authority with its own budget, laws, and loyalty system. Third, let's have a look at white-collar crime, a quiet flow upwards. Another world is what English language literature calls white-collar crime, right? Fraud, balance sheet manipulation, tax evasion, money laundering, schemes with the securities and complex financial instruments. Unlike street crime, here redistribution flows from the bottom up. William Shantz in The Collapse of American Criminal Justice shows how the complexity of the law and procedural rules give huge advantages to those with money for lawyers and connections. As a result, the system often treats petty street offenses much more harshly than major financial schemes. Thomas Piketty's work on capital shows that where wealth and political influence are concentrated in a narrow group, that very group gains the capacity to build loopholes and soft rules for itself into the law. Minimum penalties for complex schemes, gentle plea deals, drawn-out trials. International organizations such as the World Bank, OECD, and Transparency International have been documenting the same story for decades. Corruption, aggressive tax optimization, money laundering, and state capture are also forms of crime, just at the top. They don't look like a mugging with a gun, but in terms of sums, a single big scheme can cost society more than hundreds of street thefts. Here, redistribution works like this. Money that could go into the common pot for roads, schools, healthcare, and social programs ends up in the pockets of particular groups through gray and semi-legal mechanisms. Lastly, let's have a look at the gray zone between business, politics, and crime, when control becomes an industry. Finally, there is a special zone, where three criminal streams intersect. Jonathan Simon, in Governing Through Crime, describes how fear of crime is used as a political resource. Under the banner of tough on crime, the necessary laws are pushed through, budgets for security agencies are expanded, and new forms of population control are introduced. David Garland, in The Culture of Control, shows how punitive policies and zero tolerance become the norm in the late democracies, and how both state and private actors adapt themselves to this rhetoric. Nils Christie, in Crime Control as Industry, goes one step further. He shows that the system of crime control itself becomes a business. Prisons, private security firms, surveillance tech manufacturers, and contractors living off government orders all begin to profit from having more and more people pass through the system. Crime here is not only a social problem, but also a stable source of income for an entire sector. As a result, the gray zones between business, politics, and the penal system become yet another mechanism of redistribution. Public fear and real crime are converted into budgets, contracts, and political dividends for those who control the security industry. At the bottom and at the top, crime turns out not to be just a collection of individual offenses, but part of the overall economic and political logic of resource redistribution in a modern democracy. If we now bring together everything we've discussed, poverty, inequality, unemployment, weak institutions, and different forms of crime as redistribution mechanisms, the next question arises naturally. What does democracy itself do with all this? One and the same label democracy on paper can in practice mean two completely different realities and approaches, either a system that reduces the causes of crime, or a system that deliberately or not produces crime and then profits from controlling it. In a working, living democracy, economic goals and business interests are balanced by strong social institutions: the family, the school, the community, local self-government. This is what Messner and Rosenfeld talk about in their institutional anomy theory, where success is measured not only in money and career, and social institutions are strong enough to hold the balance. Crime rates are lower. The state does not walk away from responsibility. It invests in education, healthcare, and a healthy labor market. Work by Lochner and Moretti shows something very simple. The higher the level of education, the lower the probability that person ends up in prison. Good schools, accessible vocational and higher education, real chances for decent employment. This is not a humanitarian luxury, but a direct investment in crime reduction. Legitimacy and trust play their role here too. Tom Tyler shows that people obey the law when they consider the police and the courts to be fair and respectful towards them. Robert Sampson adds the neighborhood level, where a collective efficacy exists, trust in residents' ability to uphold order together. Laws are followed not only out of fear, but because that's how things are done here. If you add what Wilkinson, Pickett, Feisenbell, and others write about lowering inequality and poverty, we get the framework of a working democracy. Institutions that reduce both their motivation and the opportunities to go into the crime, because there is a chance for a normal life and an order that people trust. But there is also another version, a decorative democracy. Formally, it has elections, a parliament, independent courts, and beautiful constitution. But in reality, inequality remains high. The welfare state is extremely weak, the elites are almost entirely unaccountable, and the institutions work selectively. Loïc Wacquant, Michel Alexander, David Garland, Jonathan Simon, William Stantz, and Elliott Currie, each in their own way describe the same picture. Such a democracy produces masses of crime and incarceration instead of eliminating the causes. Social programs are cut, the labor market keeps people in chronic instability, the poor and racial or ethnic minorities become the main clients of police and prisons, while complex financial and political abuses at the top remain almost unpunished. The paradox is that a formally democratic system massively criminalizes the bottom, not top, and simultaneously turns crime control into profitable industry and convenient political tool. In the end, this is the key conclusion from all the previous blocks. Poverty, inequality, and weak institutions are not automatically produced by democracy. The question is, which democracy we are talking about? One model uses political mechanisms to reduce inequality, strengthen education, and heal rather than lock up social problems, thereby genuinely shrinking space for crime. The other model under the same world democracy allows wealth and power to accumulate in a narrow layer, pushes millions of people into chronic poverty, and then builds a punitive infrastructure around them, from street-level control to prison industry. To keep everything we've discussed from remaining abstract theory about good and bad democracies, let's bring back into the frame a country we've already used as an example of a country made by people for people, Switzerland. It's on this example that we can clearly see how a combination of relative equality, functioning social mechanisms, and strong institutions literally compresses the space for crime, reducing it to statistical noise rather than a parallel system of survival. If you look at the bluntest and the most honest metric, intentional homicide, Switzerland has, for years, been at the very bottom of the world rankings. According to the latest data, we are talking about roughly 0.6 intentional homicides per 100,000 people and 53 cases per year, which is many times lower than the global average and lower than in many other developed countries. Yes, there are microstates like Monaco that show a formal zero in some years, but their population is only tens of thousands. Switzerland, with nearly 9.1 million people, is a large, quite complex economy, and its low level of violence can no longer be rewritten off as a small number effect. It's the result of how the system is really built. At the same time, the country doesn't crush crime with mass incarceration, about 77 prisoners per 100,000 people versus a global median of about 140 per 100,000 and several times lower than the US. In other words, the system addresses some root causes instead of simply inflating the punitive apparatus. The social structure is not at all like some mythical socialist paradise. According to OECD and World Bank data, the Gini coefficient for disposable income in Switzerland is about 0.29 to 0.30. Not perfect equality, but noticeably better than in most Anglo-Saxon democracies where inequality is much higher. The relative income poverty rate is around 8 to 10% of the population at the very high average incomes, and one of the lowest unemployment rates in OECD countries. On the top of that, there is a powerful system of mandatory health insurance, a well-developed vocational education system, insurance funds, and targeted support for families. All of this together produces what Wilkinson and Pickett wrote about: a society where basic needs are met for most people and where the gap between top and bottom does not turn it into an abyss, so the system generates much less violence and crime as a side effect of inequality. The second layer is how institutions function and how much people trust them. On rule of law indices, Switzerland is constantly in the global top 10. On the World Bank's rule of law indicator, it is in the group of countries with the strongest legal systems on the planet. OECD surveys of trust in public institutions shows that around 75% of Swiss people report high or moderately high trust in the police, about 69% in the courts, and more than half in parliament, the civil service, and local authorities. This is exactly the kind of legitimacy that Tom Tyler and Robert Samsus write about. When people see the police and courts as theirs, obeying the law becomes the normal, default mode of behavior, not a naive strategy for suckers, in the face of a cynical and corrupt system. The third layer is the labor market and the architecture of democracy itself. Switzerland chronically lacks workers, not jobs. Unemployment is amongst the lowest in Europe, and it is employers who have to compete for people, not people for any job at whatever wage. Add to this a strong dual vocational education system, a significant role for trade unions in several sectors, and, crucially, real mechanisms of direct democracy via referendums and votes, citizens directly influence, tax policy, the pension system, housing market regulation, and many other key questions. As a result, for an average person working honestly, paying taxes and resolving conflicts through the courts is, in most cases, more profitable and safer than getting involved in crime. The system we have been describing theoretically in previous blog is, to a large extent, implemented in practice here. The risk of chronic unemployment and total hopelessness is kept close to absolute zero. Of course, Switzerland is not the only example. Very low homicide levels and relatively mild penal policies are also found in Norway, Japan, the Netherlands, some other European countries, and microstates like Monaco, where not a single homicide may be recorded for years. And almost everywhere, if you look at the package of indicators, we see the same toolkit. Relatively equal income distribution, functioning social programs, high trust in institutions, and strong rule of law. But the Swiss case is especially important for our episode, because here this is combined with a very high per capita level of wealth and a complex competitive economy. In other words, safety and low crime are achieved not by freezing development and extracting efficiencies, but alongside one of the highest standards of living in the world and considerable wealth for a certain share of the population. Taken together, Switzerland in our comparison is not an ideal and not a fairy tale, but a demonstration of a simple, if uncomfortable, idea. Where the democracy genuinely smooths out inequality, keeps poverty under control, builds predictable courts and understandable, generally fair police force, the space for crime shrinks rapidly to a very narrow niches. Where the system instead leaves millions of people in long-term poverty, keeps them in fear of unemployment, and at the same time allows elites to break the rules without consequences, crime stops being a deviation and becomes a logical, sometimes the only understandable strategy for survival. In this sense, the question for any modern democracy is no longer the soft, what is our crime rate, but something much harsher. What share of your crime has been produced by the very political economic system you run? And by you here, we mean both politicians and citizens, who should be demanding decisions and accountability from those politicians. In the next episode, we will logically continue this line and move from crime to money. The episode will be called Who Gets the Money? We will examine how governments' budgets are formed in democratic countries, who gets the main flows and for what, from social programs to defense and infrastructure, which sectors and companies receive direct or hidden support, and when some democracies are far more eager to subsidize business and big projects than programs that directly reduce poverty and, as a result, crime. And the key question there will be, is this really a rational strategy for society as a whole, or just another bias in favor of those who already benefit from the existing rules of the game? All the studies and sources we relied on in this episode are listed in the description under the video. There you will find the titles of the books and links to the data, so that if you want, you can check the numbers yourself and read the originals. As always, we are not asking you to take our word for it. Look at the facts, verify them, compare them, and draw your own conclusions. And of course, stay informed and educated. Thank you for watching this long episode, and see you in the next one. If you like this episode, please subscribe, please click the like button, and try to share this video with those who might be interested in that. Thank you.